Thank you. So we'll be continuing this same theme with quite a few common elements to the last two talks, it turns out. So we are looking at a mine slightly further to the east from the last talk. And so east of Rustenburg into what is known as the wide reef facies, which we just saw introduced in the last talk as well. So just expanding, I'm going to have to use these. We're looking at the Merensky Reef in this study. And again, well, we have our two different drill holes not too far apart from the Eland mine. And the total width of the Merensky Reef package here is in excess of 10 meters. So it's completely sub-economic as a result. You can see that so there's a fairly well-developed pegmatoid in one of these, and it's underneath the top enriched zone. I'm going to try to avoid using the term top reef and bottom reef, because we also call the package a reef, and then it gets very reefy. So underneath that, in both cases, we have PGE enriched zones defining the top and bottom of the proper reef. So yeah, there's a well-developed pegmatoid in the one drill core, a very sort of poorly developed one that you can see in thin section, but not very well in the core in the other one. And there's only one actual chromatite present at any of the four contacts in this particular case. So we'll see that that does make a difference, but it doesn't stop the PGE enrichments at the contacts. Okay, so the reason we sampled wide reef facies specifically was that you still have mineralization, but the idea is that the PGE distributions are more spread out. Because it's sub-economic, so in this case, the company was drilling through the Merensky to get to the UG2, which is what they were mining. They were happy to give us the core. We could have the full core instead of quarter core, which meant we could take more tightly spaced samples and still get enough PGE to analyze in whole rock analyses. And the chromatographic separation of the PGE peaks based on, this is stolen from one of Alan's old conference abstracts from years ago, Alan Boudreau. And so we can sort of synthesize this kind of distribution of the PGE and their friends in terms of vertical position based on their preferential partitioning into sulfides. So we were trying to see if we could see this in the Merensky samples, because the normal Merensky Reef, when it's a meter or two, the PGE are very much concentrated in those top and bottom contacts. And what we tend to see, this diagram is from a summary from Maurice Villion's work. The PGE, and this is from one of Tony Nalder's papers on the Bushveld. So we see here a total abundance of PGE in red, showing you where the actual top and bottom contacts are. We see there's no particular fractionation of the IPGE and the PPGE in here. So we're not seeing any obvious separation. So, and we can look through many examples from this 2009 paper, and we don't see any really convincing separation of phases here. But these are all from the actual mining areas. So what we found were these sorts of variations. So yeah, we're seeing total PGE again in red, and then the PPG IPG ratio in blue, and then just zeroing in on platinum palladium, so within the PPGE in green. You see that the platinum palladium ratio is not doing anything too dramatic, but we see zones where the ratio of the IPGE to PPG are quite variable. I mean, in general, they're decreasing from the enriched zone at the top downwards. And then a lower zone, which in this case is in the kind of non-pegmatoidal rocks, where it's relatively constant, slightly increasing downwards. The problem is, as we saw in the previous talk, you don't want a Merensky mechanism necessarily that depends on the specific location of where the pegmatoid is going to be, because sometimes it's below the top contact, sometimes it's above the bottom one, sometimes it's below the bottom one. and sometimes it's basically not there at all. So in this case, we're trying to use the existence of the pegmatoid as a kind of clue to what's happening in those zones. So if we zoom in on the top and bottom contacts here, what we see is above the top contact, so in A and B here, there are significant, or at least noticeable, depletions in all of the PGE just above the top contact. And then there's the enrichment below that on a scale of less than centimeters. And this is because we could take very thin slices of this full core, which you're not normally able to do. And then at the bottom contact, we again see a depletion, but now below the bottom enriched zone. So it seems to be sort of symmetrical above and below the Merensky Reef package. There are these very localized depletions of PGE. So what do we make of that? So the way I interpret this then is that this is difficult to explain by any purely vertical movement process by itself, right? So a process of vertical settling or of vertical upward movement of magma or fluids alone shouldn't make these kind of symmetrical patterns around the reef. It should reproduce itself at each contact, ideally. So that doesn't mean that I can say anything about whether or not either of those did or didn't happen. I'm just suggesting that they can't alone by themselves explain this distribution. So something must have been superimposed on top of that. Okay, so another interesting feature is that it appears that the PPGE have been removed from the footwall rocks in these sections. And this example shows this nicely. So in the hanging wall leucocratic rocks, we see, the sort of normal sulfide controlled looking PPGE patterns. Then in the mineralized horizon, the abundances go up. This enrichment in gold disappears. But then in the footwall and orthositic rocks, we've just removed the palladium and gold peaks completely. So the implication is they have been mobilized upwards based on the distributions. So as possible mechanisms then for moving the PGE around, the presence of the pegmatoidal zones, in this case, associated with these changes in the PPGE-IPGE ratio, suggests the involvement of fluids in some capacity. So the two choices would seem to be at high temperatures when there's still silicate liquid present to maybe high temperature subsolidus, and then also down to the low temperature associations we've heard about in the last talks, and we'll see more of in a minute. So let's look at the PG mineralogy to see if that gives us any clues. So this is TEMA SEM EDS work done in London by my co-authors. So this is the one chromatite horizon that we do have here. It's got associated platinum phases. They're not trapped in the chromites, but they're associated with them. And if we look in more detail at the speciation here, what we see is that in the bottom chromatite reef here, most of the PGE are in the form of sulfides. Whereas in the top contact where there's no chromatite, the sulfide component is significantly reduced, and most of them are as bismuthotellurides, as we heard in the previous talk. And as we go into this zone below the top contact, the sulfides disappear completely, and it's now completely dominated by bismuth, tellurium, and arsenic compounds. There's quite a lot of galena through this whole section as well, which I was somewhat not expecting. And if we look in detail at some of the PGE phases this is in the upper enriched contact zone, we see regularly these kind of, I'm not going to call it zoned, but let's say rimmed relationships where primary platinum sulfides in this case, altering progressively to antimony and then arsenic compounds, and with a little pyrrhotite associated with the outermost phases. So with decreasing temperature, presumably. And then we also see, as Malta described, locally the association of the PGE phases with basically green schist facies assemblages, actinolite, chloride, quartz, and chalcopyrite. So again, showing us that the system is remaining active, at least on a small scale, until quite low temperatures. So the model I proposed to explain this is quite similar to the model that was just proposed, or just presented. I'm not suggesting this as a unique solution, just again as a possible explanation that's consistent with the data distribution. So the idea again here would be also emplacement of a sill. So a sill in the context that it's a new magma pulse emplaced onto what I guess you call the transient floor, where we're on a largely solid floor, but still a fairly high crystal proportion above it. So it's not solidified. We're not intruding it into a solid package. But we have thermal contrast then at the top and bottom produced by this, and solidification contrasts. So effectively permeability contrasts that are generated. And then, so as the sill then crystallizes, the areas with higher porosity and permeability accumulate the magmatic fluid, and that migrates upwards, whether driven by compaction or buoyancy or both, and preferentially mobilizes the PPGE. So we see that IPGE, PPGE fractionation happening in there. And then they're concentrated at the top and bottom contact, which I'm interpreting as limited by permeability. And that's what then draws the PPG out of the floor into the bottom contact and out of the roof into the top contact, producing those relationships that we see. So then I have to thank the 2 master students that were involved in projects relating to this. Some of this is published in this Canadian mineralogist paper from a year or 2 ago in one of the Tony Naldrett memorial volumes. Acknowledge permission from Glencore for accessing their core, and subsequently sold the deposit to Northam, and they've also let us talk about it. And then, yeah, the PG whole rock analyses were done at Lab Mater or Lab Mater. So thank you very much.
Hi, Steve. Is the entire Merensky cyclic unit actually present there, or is this kind of a degraded version?
You mean, do we have like a big footwall and orthosite and this sort of thing? Or
Not so much the footwall. Have you got the footwall, then the Merensky Reef package, then an anorthosite, and then the bastard?
yeah, so I think that is all there, but we didn't carry on sampling upwards. No.
Steve,
Yes.
so in your model, Merensky Reef or unit intrudes below Bastard Reef.
Right.
But we know from some of the, at least I am aware of 2 observations where Bastard Reef cuts through the Merensky Reef, but holding Merensky Reef, suggesting that the Merensky was the first to form and then Bastard. So how do you reconcile these field observation with your model?
So I don't need, I mean, the question has arisen before whether the top of this has to be the magmatic, like where the top enrichment zone, does that have to be where the physical top of the magma pulse was? And I can think of alternative ways where it need not be. I think it works best if there's a thermal contrast there. As long as you have a permeability contrast, I think you could create the top PG enrichment contact, and then there can still be more magma from that same event above. So that's how I reconcile it, by bullshitting.
Yes, Steve. So you're talking about depletion of PGEs in the underlying anorthosite.
Yeah.
So I mean, the
Very
question
good.
always arises when you're talking about depletion of things. How do you know what was there in the first place? So I mean, that anorthosite under the Merensky Reef is usually, you know, a really pure adcumulate rock with no sulfides in it. So how do you know there was any platinum and palladium in it to begin with?
Well, I'm just comparing it with what's on top. So you're right. I don't know that. And I think I think what I could see is a very localized effect. I'm not suggesting major scavenging. I don't at least have evidence for that being a large volume effect from what I've got so far.
Very quickly, regarding the question, you know, whether the Bastard Reef cuts down into the Merensky Reef, that's been a big debate, of course, and this these descriptions of these feeder relationships have been at the center, at the core of arguments that, you know, the arguing against the SIL model. However, as far as I know, I've never seen the Bastard cutting down across the Merensky Reef, and as far as I know, the evidence that Rice cites comes from 2 sketches of mine geologists in 2 books. There are no photographs, as far as I know, Rice. Nobody has really ever seen this that I know. These papers are all rather old. I don't know whether these people still live. So, you know, I think at least we should